My dear faithful, the Mass today is the feast of St. Pius X on September the 3rd in your Missal. There's a few announcements to be made today. The first is that the second collection today is for the Academy on the first Sunday of the month. The school year starts this week on Tuesday. It's a different schedule, so those of you who have children in the school, please know that on Tuesday it's sort of an orientation day and a day of recollection. We have Mass on Tuesday, though normally we will not have Mass at 11:15 except on the school, when school has Mass on Monday, Wednesdays, and Fridays. But Tuesday's an exception, so you'll notice there is Mass at 11:15 on Tuesday. Also, the forms are out for the school skate-a-thon/jogathon, so you can pick those up in the vestibule of the church. Tomorrow there is a Labor Day picnic at the Shrives House in Cresswell. Excuse me. The directions to their home is on the bulletin board in the back, so I hope a number of you will be able to attend. And Father Height was asked to announce that his suspension was lifted. It was something that brought him a great deal of comfort, even though none of us really believed that he was suspended, but it was a great comfort to him. So please pray for Father Height. He's in his last days, it seems, so he's gotten weaker. So pray for him at Mass today. The epistle for today, the feast of St. Pius X, and even though it is the 13th Sunday after Pentecost, all the readings are from the feast of this our great patron saint. The epistle is from the first letter to the Thessalonians, chapter 2. Brethren, we had confidence in our God to speak unto you the gospel of God in much carefulness. For our exhortation was not of error, nor of uncleanness, nor in deceit. But as we are approved by God that the gospel should be committed to us, even so we speak, not as pleasing men, but God, who proves our hearts. For neither have we used at any time the speech of flattery, as you know, nor taken an occasion of covetousness, God is witness, nor sought we glory of men, neither of you nor of others, whereas we might have been burdensome to you as the apostles of Christ, but we became little ones in the midst of you, as if a nurse should cherish her children. So desirous of you, we would gladly impart unto you not only the gospel of God, but also our own souls, because you are become most dear to us. Please stand now for the Holy Gospel, which is from St. John, chapter 21. At that time Jesus said to Simon Peter, Simon, son of John, lovest thou me more than these? He said to him, Yea, Lord, thou knowest that I love thee. He said to him, Feed my lambs. He said to him again, Simon, son of John, lovest thou me? He said to him, Yea, Lord, thou knowest that I love thee. He said to him, Feed my lambs. He said to him the third time, Simon, son of John, lovest thou me? Peter was grieved because he had said to him the third time, Lovest thou me? And he said to him, Lord, thou knowest all things. Thou knowest that I love thee. He said to him, Feed my sheep. Thus far the words of today's Holy Gospel. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Ghost, amen. My dear Reverend Father and my dear faithful, I asked Father Hunter if I could give the sermon today because I wanted to speak to you about St. Pius X and this great feast day. There's so much about him that, I hope that from today's sermon that you will come away with a greater love not only of Pius X, but also a better understanding of why our society is named after him. So many people don't know anything about St. Pius X, and they hear the name Society of Pius X, they have no understanding of what it means. Well, his name in the world was Giuseppe Sarto, which in English would be Joe Taylor. He was a very common name, but Giuseppe Sarto was the oldest of 8 surviving children, and his family was very poor. He grew up on a farm in the country, His family barely had enough to get by. But because he was the oldest of the family, he learned early on that he had to take care of his younger brothers and sisters, and that he had to be very watchful over his things, over his possessions, so that he wouldn't waste anything, because their money was very tight. And he also learned from his family that he had to work hard. And he used to say, work is man's chief duty on earth. He's a very hard worker his whole life. But as I said, he was from a poor family, and so all his life he lived poor. Even though he would rise up and become one of the greatest popes in the history of the church, I think he might be the only pope who ever rose up from being a simple country boy and then went through every grade of the clergy. And he kept that humility and that simplicity his whole life long, and that great love for the poor. Do you know that in those days they used to use fountain pens? And so he used to, just in his simplicity, when he became a priest, he used to clean his fountain pen by wiping it on the sleeve of his cassock. Well, unfortunately, he did that when he became pope, and it wasn't so easy to clean. He just forgot himself, and he wiped it on the sleeve of his white cassock as pope. But that shows you the kind of simple man he was his whole life. He rose up from being a country boy to becoming one of the greatest popes in the church. Now, his parents couldn't afford to send him to school. They had no money. And so they made every sacrifice they could possibly make to help him. They knew he had a vocation from early on. And so they wanted to help him pursue his desire to become a priest. And so even though they had nothing, somehow they put away money to send him off to school. In order to also help his parents out, when he was sent to school, he would walk 5 miles each way to school barefoot to conserve his shoes. His parents had no money to buy shoes or buy clothes, and so he took care of everything he had. And that's a lesson for our children to learn. Take care of your things and don't waste. Your parents spend so much money on you. We should learn to take care of the things we have. And so St. Pius X, think about it. He walked 5 miles to school every day. That would be as if you lived in Crow and walked here to school every day. And he would, as I said, he would walk barefoot. He would take off his shoes and sling them over his shoulders, and he would walk barefoot to conserve his shoes. And you can imagine how he got laughed at for that. The other kids in the school would laugh at him and make fun of him. But he never let it bother him. He just smiled too. He didn't want to tell them that his family was very poor. And so he just said he preferred to walk barefoot. And so they made fun of him. But he did it to help his family out. Finally, the parish priest of the town he grew up in, which was Riesi in northern Italy in the province of Venice, the parish priest at Riesi was able to help him out. In those days, they had so many vocations that they only took the best of the best. And he was a great student. Giuseppe Sarto was a very good student and a very good boy. But he had no money to go to the seminary. His only hope was that he would win a scholarship to the seminary. And the parish priest wrote letters for him and helped train him and teach him. And he did win the scholarship and was sent off to the seminary. At the seminary, his dad died when he was in the seminary, and he knew by a premonition that his father had passed away. And he went to the rector, and he had tears in his eyes, and he said, "I have to go home." And the rector said, "Why?" And he said, "My father just died." And there was no human voice that told him so. And so already at an early age, it seemed that he was being marked out for greatness by God. He became assistant priest when he was ordained in 1858. He was just a simple assistant or curate at Tombolo. And he worked very, very hard. But as a young priest, he still had a lot of room for improvement. And he had to read his sermons to his pastor. I'm glad that we don't have to do that now. But he had to read his sermons to his pastor, and the pastor, listening to one of his first sermons, said, "That's a pile of rubbish. Tear it up, throw that out." And he was, of course, very embarrassed, and he continued to work hard on his sermons. And one day he's reading a sermon to his parish priest, and the parish priest said, "Stop, stop, stop, stop." And he thought he was going to be told to throw this one out too. And the priest said to Father Sarto, he said, "You got to be careful that you don't become a better preacher than your pastor." So he improved very quickly and became a very fine preacher. Just to show you his love for the poor that he kept his whole life, he was given a silver pocket watch when he was ordained. Family and friends had saved up money to give him an ordination gift, and they gave him a beautiful silver pocket watch. But you know what? That pocket watch was more often in the pawn shop than it was on his person, because whenever he needed some money to help people, he would go pawn his watch. That's the kind of man he was. After 9 years at Tombolo, he became the parish priest at Salzano, which was a pretty nice parish, but he continued to help very much the poor people of the area, and he worked very, very hard. His light would always be the last one on at night and the first one on in the morning. He was a very, very hard worker. But some people say he wore himself out at Salzano. One of the priests tried to help him and said, "Father, you shouldn't work so late. Remember, he who works late works poorly." And Father Sarto said, "Well, that's good advice. Why don't you take it and go to bed?" So but he did kind of wear himself out. There was an epidemic of cholera in Salzano, and he got sick, taking care of the sick and the poor in the city. After 9 years of parish priest, he was made canon of Treviso and spiritual director at the seminary. A canon is someone who is attached to the cathedral, and they sing in the choir, and they teach chant, and they work at the cathedral. But he also was attached to the seminary, so he sort of had a twofold job. And at the seminary, his love for Gregorian chant was widely known, and he taught Gregorian chant at the seminary, and he was the spiritual director of the seminary, so he gave a lot of talks to the seminarians. But he also somehow found time to even teach the little children of the area their catechism. He would gather the little first communicants near him, and he would teach them to prepare them for their first Holy Communion. After 9 years of seminary at the seminary in the canon of Treviso, he became the Bishop of Mantua. Do you know that he wept when he was named bishop? He begged the Pope not to make him a bishop, that he was unworthy. And when he became bishop, he continued to wear his black cassock all the time, just the simple black cassock of any parish priest. But what he did as Bishop of Mantua is he looked after the seminary. He really looked after the seminary, and he reformed it. Up until that time, the seminaries were not very well run in his area. They didn't always have the best training. And after him, the seminary was very well run. That's what he did first. He looked after his priests. He had a great love for his priests. But he also would surprise them from time to time on visits to the parishes. As bishop, of course, he could go to any parish in his diocese. And one early morning, he showed up at a parish, and there was nobody there, nobody hearing confessions. And so he himself went into the confessional and started hearing confessions. Well, the priest had overslept and got up and went to the church and found another priest in his confessional, and so he got upset, and he went to the confessional. He ripped back the curtain to see his bishop sitting there hearing confessions. So the priest was embarrassed, but Bishop Sarto was very, very kind to him and just reminded him of his duty to his people. And that's how he was. All his priests loved him as their bishop in Mantua. He would send them on retreats to the Capuchin monastery because he realized that the holiness of the clergy was what made good parishes. So he made sure to look after his priests. And he really reformed his diocese. I want you to understand that even before he was pope, he was already a saint. If he had never become pope, he would have been like St. John Vianney, a saint of parish priests, or he would have been like St. Alphonsus, a model of bishops. Well, we know him as St. Pius X, but he was already such a holy man before this. In 1893, he was named Cardinal Patriarch of Venice. And the Freemasons really ran Venice. And so when he was made patriarch, they had this, the Catholics, of course, were jubilant and had a celebration. And all the Freemasons closed their windows and doors to him. And the Catholics realized what this meant. They hated Cardinal Sarto, because the Freemasons recognized that the ones they had to fear were the good and holy priests and bishops. They didn't have anything to fear from the powerful and from the rich. They had to fear the good, humble priests. And so they hated Pius X. But he said to the people of Venice, he said, "Don't you worry. They may have closed their doors to me, but we'll open their doors and windows." In other words, he was indicating that we'll open things up and get those guys out of office. And he did, because he encouraged the Catholics to run for office. And it's interesting that in Venice, under Cardinal Sarto, Catholics took over and became the leaders of the city. He really was that encouraging that political movement for Catholicism in Venice. And so he was a very humble and good shepherd of the people of Venice. As I said, he wore his black cassock every day instead of the red of a cardinal. And he hardly was ever at Rome. The people of the priests and bishops of Rome didn't even know him. And Leo XIII would say, "You have to come more often to Rome." But he hardly ever did, because he was like a parish priest of all of Venice. That's the kind of man he was. And when Leo XIII died in 1903, one of the priests pointed out to him and said, "Well, you've been 9 years as curate at Tombolo, 9 years parish priest at Salzano, 9 years canon of Treviso, 9 years bishop of Mantua, and now 9 years cardinal patriarch of Venice." And so the priest said, "You're going to go to Rome, and you're either going to become pope or you're going to die." And he said, "Well, then I'd rather have the latter. I'd rather die than be pope." He never thought he'd be elected pope. The people of Venice said, "Make sure you come back to us." They had such a love for him, they realized he's so good and holy, he could become pope. But he just laughed at that, and they said, "You come back to us," and he said, "I'll come back alive or dead." Well, my dear friends, he did come back when he was dead. They brought his body back to Venice, because as you know, when he went to Rome in 1903 for the election, he started getting votes in the very first ballot. And it was surprising because hardly anyone knew him. And yet they recognized his goodness and his holiness. And so he got more and more votes. Cardinal Rampolla actually was getting the most votes. He had been Secretary of State under Leo XIII. But he stagnated. His votes stagnated around 29, 30 votes. And you needed 2/3 of the election, of the electoral college, to be named to be named pope. And so Rampolla wasn't going to get elected, and many of the other cardinals started switching their votes, and Cardinal Sarto started getting more and more votes. And he wept. He said, "Do not vote for me. I cannot be pope. I cannot do this. I am just a simple priest. I'm ignorant." And it was kind of funny. He didn't speak other languages, except, of course, he spoke Latin and Italian. But he didn't know any other languages. And one of the other cardinals said, started speaking to him in French. And he said, I don't speak French. And the cardinal said, then you cannot be Pope. And he said, thank God, I don't want to be Pope. But he kept getting more votes, and it it was clear he was going to be elected. And he was in the chapel of St. Paul at the Vatican praying and just begging God to deliver him. And cardinals said that it was like watching our Lord in the agony in the garden. And he was begging to be delivered from this heavy cross. And one of those cardinals who comforted him was Cardinal Mary del Val. He actually wasn't a cardinal yet. He was just a young cleric. But Pius X remembered the goodness of this young priest, and he would name Cardinal Mary del Val as a cardinal and as Secretary of State under him, even though he became one of the youngest cardinals and one of the youngest Secretary of States in the history of the Church. But Cardinal Mary del Val had gone to him that night and said to him, you know, God will help you. It is a cross, but God will assist you in carrying it. And so the next morning when he was elected, he was asked if he would accept the election, and he said, I accept it as a cross. And they asked him, what name would you have? And he said, since all the popes who have suffered the most in this past century took the name Pius, I will take the name Pius as well. And so he became known as Pope Pius X. His reign would be 11 years as pontiff, and he would become known as the Pope of the Holy Eucharist. One of the first things he did as Pope was he encouraged children at a young age to start receiving communion. You can imagine why, because as a country priest, as a bishop, he saw how there were so many innocent children who were losing their innocence before they ever made their first communion. And so when he became Pope, one of the first things he did was he reduced the age for First Communion to the age of reason. Up until then, you had to be 12 or 13 years old to make your First Communion. And he's the one who brought it down to 6, 7, 8 years old. And just for that alone, we owe him so much. Do you know that there was once a lady who came to him? She had a 4-year-old boy, and she asked the Holy Father if her son could make his First Communion. And Pius X said, well, he is very young. He said, he started questioning the boy and asking him his catechism, and the boy knew all his prayers and all the catechism questions. And Pius X said, how many natures has Jesus Christ? And the little 4-year-old boy said, he hath 2 natures, the nature of God and the nature of man. And Pius X marveled. This little boy was 4 years old. And he said he has such an understanding of the catechism. And he said, you bring him back to me in the morning, I'll give him First Holy Communion. And so the little children just flocked to Pius X. But he was also not only a lover of the poor and the little, but he also was the hammer of heretics. The modernists feared him. The modernists had gotten a foothold in the church at that time, and he basically drove them out with just a swoop of his pen in writing the encyclical Pascendi Gregis. He condemned modernism as the synthesis of all heresies. And the modernists were exposed for what they were, and they were basically driven out of the church for 50 years. They lost their positions in the seminaries. He never appointed a modernist as a bishop or any position of authority. And so the modernists basically had to go underground for 50 years due to St. Pius X. He also reformed canon law. He did the work of the reform of the laws of the church, and he gave away so much to the poor that people would just flock to him. And even while he was alive, he was a miracle worker. And this is something that people don't realize, the miracles that he worked even when he was alive. But he was such a humble man that it was embarrassing to him. And of course, he would just say, it's from God, it's not me. But the people realized what a saint they had for a pope. Just to give you a couple examples, there was a man, he was a father of a family, and he had an accident and his arm was paralyzed. And so he couldn't use his arm and he couldn't hold a job. And he came to the Holy Father in a general audience and he said, he told the Holy Father a story, and no doctor had been able to help him. And Pius X said, but what could I do? And the man said, if you will bless me, I know I will be healed. And Pius X took the man's arm, in the paralyzed arm in his hands, and he lifted up his eyes to heaven and he prayed and he blessed the man's arm, and it was instantly healed. And the man started jumping up and down for joy and started yelling. And this was in a general audience. The man started saying, I'm cured, I'm cured. And Pius X turned around and went, shh, be quiet, don't tell anybody. And a little girl who had a diseased foot, she had not been able to walk her whole life. When she was 1 year old, she had an infection and her foot was lame and she had never been able to walk. But somehow she got a sock of the Holy Father sent to her. And she put it on her foot and she was cured. And when Pius X was told this, he started roaring with laughter and he said, I wore those socks for years and my feet are killing me. And it's true. He suffered a lot from aching feet. But he was just a simple, humble priest who had become pope. And, I told you the story about him wiping his fountain pen on his sleeve. But he was like that. He sat in the office just like a regular priest. You see pictures of him with his books and his papers all stacked up around him. And in front of him, a statue of St. John Vianney, who actually wasn't a saint yet. Pius X would declare him venerable and blessed John Vianney. But Pius X was such a great pope. He died in 1914 at the breakout of World War I. It broke his heart. And people say he died of a broken heart from the start of the war. He saw what World War I would do, which was destroy the remnants of Christianity in Europe. The few countries that remained that were still Catholic would no longer be after the war. World War I was horrible for what it did to the Catholic Church and to the faith. It was Catholics fighting against Catholics. Do you realize that? That the French Catholics and Irish Catholics were fighting against the Italian Catholics were on their side, were fighting against the Bavarian Catholics and the Austrian Catholics. It was Catholics killing one another, and it broke Pius X's heart. It just broke his heart. And he died a month after the war started. He died on August the 20th, 1914. And he was already hailed as a saint. Pius XII in 1951 would declare him blessed and then would canonize him in 1954. And Pius XII said that it was the most important thing he did in his pontificate. Do you know why? Because Pius XII saw that now, 50 years later, the modernists had gotten a foothold in the church once more. And Pius XII was saying, we need the help of St. Pius X to drive the modernists out of the church. Vatican II took place 8 years later, and the church was completely corrupted by the modernists. But along came a bishop who started an order and named it the Society of St. Pius X. So it's very interesting if you look at what Pius XII said and did in canonizing him, that we need him now to counteract the modernists, and what Archbishop Lefebvre did, taking St. Pius X as the patron of his new priestly order. And so our order is called the Society of St. Pius X. And we owe a lot to this great pope. And if you look at the life of Archbishop Lefebvre, it's eerie how similar he is to St. Pius X. They're cut from the same cloth. And so, my dear friends, today I wanted to ask you to pray, especially for the Society of St. Pius X. After Mass today, we'll have benediction of the Blessed Sacrament. We'll sing the hymn Sancte Pie Decime to honor St. Pius X. Pray a lot for our society, that through the intercession of St. Pius X, modernism might be overthrown again, and that the traditional faith might be restored as he did when he was Pope, in bringing the Holy Eucharist to the simple and the humble folk. So may he do it again through the society that is named after him. And also let us pray a lot for Pope Benedict XVI, that through the prayers of St. Pius X, Pope Benedict might become a saintly, holy Pope as his predecessor. We have a lot to pray for, but we also have a lot to be thankful for. Let us all lift up our hearts today on this feast day and thank God for giving us such a holy patron saint, such a great Pope of the Church, who even now, 100 years after he was Pope, still his words, his actions, his example is still reverberating throughout the entire Catholic world. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Ghost, amen.